Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Bannister from SOLAS, and welcome to another SOLAS webinar. This is the video series where I am joined by an amazing guest from somewhere around the world who's written a book, got a great story, got something to help us think through some of the big questions about the Christian faith. And boy, do we have a guest for you this evening. I'm thrilled and excited to welcome to the webinar someone I've followed for years. I had the privilege of speaking alongside him at a conference in Canada a few years ago. J. Warner Wallace, or known to most people as just Jim, but his writing name, definitely J. Warner Wallace. Jim, welcome to the webinar. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I remember that conference. That was a lot of fun. And I remember thinking at the time, I wish I was as
right?
funny.
Wasn't it Vancouver?
Yes, it was. I remember thinking at the time, I wish I was as funny as Andy Bannister. That's what I was thinking at the time, because I remember you were hilarious.
I wish I was as well equipped as you, but actually we're going to tease listeners with this, viewers with this, because my memory of you presenting, Jim, is before you in the break, before you did your presentation, you set the stage up like a crime scene. There was incident tape and a body talked on the floor. And why you've done that, I don't know. We'll come to that. So, Jim, you wear various hats, right? But author, speaker, kind of writer, and cold case detective. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I still get a chance to consult on some of the bigger cases here in Los Angeles County, only because the same DAs, deputy district attorneys that I worked with back in the day when I was working full-time in that capacity are still employed. And they sometimes will come to me just to ask, hey, can you do this small thing for me? And I'm trying to figure out a way to squeeze that in while we're writing and speaking. So yeah, still get a chance to do it all.
And we'll come to this as we go through the interview, but obviously you've written quite a lot of books sort of tying those two worlds together. But let's start kind of right at the beginning, because your own kind of personal story is fascinating. As I understand, you're a Christian now, very much so, but you weren't always the way. You were an atheist, also homicide detective. That was the main thing you were doing. How did those two worlds kind of collide? And particularly, I'm interested about how it was perhaps being a detective set you up to then take a look at the Christian faith. What was the journey that brought you to investigating Christianity and then deciding that actually these things are true?
Well, I mean, it was just my wife was persistent about when we had kids. She kind of wondered, should we add this further dimension in parenting? We had been together about 18 years before either one of us became Christians. But at the time, she was thinking, well, should we add another layer to our parenting and raise our kids with some kind of transcendent worldview that might help them in some way? And I was not really interested in doing that. I mean, I wasn't raised that way, and I have no Christians in my family, so I just didn't. But I was willing to please Susie. If she wanted to go to church, I'll go to church with her. And we didn't really have any experience though in evangelical churches. So we walked into a huge mega church here in Southern California. And, the pastor pitched Jesus in a way that someone like me would be at least interested to buy a Bible. He said that a lot of things about Jesus that day, but the thing that he said that stuck in my mind was he said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And I thought, well, is that true? And so I bought a Bible to see if it was true. Now look, for most of us who work in this profession long enough, we become case makers of one nature or another, and we will build cases about all kinds of ridiculous things that most people don't need to build a case for. So if we're going to buy a car, we're going to have a 5-point case for why we should buy the car. If we're going to talk about our marriage, we've got we're making cases to each other. I'm sure we're driving our spouses crazy. But this was the only way I knew to examine any kind of claim. And so when this claim of Christianity, I was reading through the Gospels, and it appears like these ancients writing the 4 Gospels want me to believe that this stuff actually happened in a particular sequence, in a particular place on the world and on the map, in a particular period of time. And so I thought, well, how do you assess these kinds of things? I mean, for me, I'm just going to assess it the way I would make a case for anything. And I did have a skill set in place that people make claims to homicide detectives all the time, most of which I don't trust. So I'm always assuming up front you're a liar until I prove otherwise, because let's face it, that works well for me as a detective. If you assume everyone's a truth teller, no one's ever going to go to jail. But if you assume everyone's a liar, eventually somebody may go to jail. And so that's really what I assume on every kind of a thing like this. So I just thought, well, I'll take the same template that I use to examine eyewitness accounts. I'll apply that template to the authors of the Gospels. Let's see how they do. And that's really how I became interested in the Gospels as a true account of the person of Jesus. And that changed everything for me, because once you decide, or you determine, that the Gospels are telling you something true about Jesus of Nazareth, you're far more likely to listen to them to see what they tell you about you. The first investigation will probably lead you to believe that, but the second investigation leads you to believe in. And I think that's what I needed to do in order to even trust that anything about Jesus was true.
One question I want to come in a minute to more about that process of detection that you apply, because that's what you've specialized in writing about. But in terms of that journey to faith for yourself, Jim, I've met quite a few sort of folks, in the police service. Probably the same goes for the military as well, actually, particularly the police, where just because the nature of what you're seeing with human nature can make you a little bit cynical and a bit jaded, because you are dealing with a lot of the rough stuff, whether it's murder or just whether you're a cop out on the beat dealing with road traffic accidents, domestics and stuff. How was that ever a question for you as you found your way to faith? Did and I suppose even now, actually, that that sort of sense of that sharp end of life that you've seen as a serving police officer?
That's a good question, and people will ask me that a lot. And I'll be honest with you, I think there's just some people who can do this kind of work and it not shake them, and some people who can't. And so I wasn't really troubled by it. My dad was a homicide detective before me. And when I was about maybe 13 or so, he showed me the first homicide scene I'd ever seen. It was on black and white, 16 millimeter film, the kind you put in a reel and stick it. We were watching in the briefing room of the police department where I ultimately ended up working. And I remember watching it and thinking I could never do this kind of work. But by the time I was in my 20s, it was like, okay, somebody has to do this kind of work. Somebody has to be at crime scenes and at murder scenes and not get shook by them. You have to be able to put those in a certain box in your head, so that I can go home and have dinner and not be thinking about it. And some people do that better than others. So a lot of it for me, that was part of my skill set coming in. I mean, that never shook me. I never bothered me that people behaved this way. You come to, maybe that's a certain kind of initial skepticism I had anyway, or maybe pessimism I had about people to begin with. And maybe that started early because I knew my dad was talking about it. And I remember, for example, when I was about 10, a girl my age was kidnapped and murdered from our city. And I thought it was like a national, and probably was, maybe, but to be honest, I don't know if anyone really knew about us outside of our region, but it shook us. I remember my dad was assigned the case, and it never got solved. And I remember thinking at the time that this is the way the world is. And I was the same age as this girl. As a matter of fact, we didn't solve that case. I reopened it in 2003, I think. We solved it in 2019. So it took us many years to solve that case. But I think because that's just the way I was kind of raised, and with that mindset, it was helpful later on when I had to do the job.
Interesting. I think as well, actually, we haven't got time to go into this particular rabbit trail, but it's, as you just spoke there, Jim, it occurred to me, of course, that one of the objections I actually sometimes come across ironically is the other end of the spectrum, where people who think that human nature is all good, we're all sugar-coated and rainbows and unicorns, and how can Christians talk about sin and human brokenness? Of course, for someone like yourself, actually quite easily, because it's pretty obvious. But look, we're here to talk about books this evening. Jim's latest book, which we will get to in the course of the interview, is a fantastic book called Person of Interest. And stay tuned, because we have 4 copies of that book to give away from Jim's publisher. And I'll be telling you later in the webinar how you can enter the competition to win those. We love giving books away. We like authors to earn money as well, but we also love giving their books away. And I'm very struck by the fact that Jim's work is not so well known over here in the UK and Europe. So hopefully, after hearing him tonight, you want to go out and dig into his books too. But the book I think I first came across that you wrote, Jim, probably the one that put you on the radar for a lot of people, I think, was Cold Case Christianity. Where you, as you described, you took those detection methods that you use in your job as a homicide detective, working again often on quite cases that have been around for a while, and found they applied really well to investigating the Christianity and the claims of Jesus. So I guess for some people hearing that, they might say, what? I mean, sorry, how does that work? Surely faith is all based on faith, right? And homicide investigations based on evidence. Explain that to us a little bit. What were those tools that you were talking about, and how did it really help shed light on the claims of
Well,
Harlan
well,
Christian
well, well,
faith?
great questions, and I think that first of all, there are some similarities, right? I mean, if I've told you that my cases typically involve reading reports, supplemental reports written by report writers who are now dead. My cases are like from 1972 to 1998. These are old cases, so it's not surprising that a 40-year-old or 50-year-old detective is no longer with us by the time I get his report. Also, they're interviewing eyewitnesses who are often dead also. So now I've got a report in which I have no access to the eyewitness and no access to the report writer to ask him, why didn't you ask this question? Why did you write the report that way? I don't have access to these people. I have to still figure out, though, if there's something about the past that is true that I can move forward with. Well, this is what the Gospels are, right? I have no access to the witnesses or the people who are writing for the witnesses. So I can't talk to Luke. Why did you write it this way? Why did you write? I have to use the same approach when forensically dissecting these reports. And we have 4 areas of concern for when it comes to eyewitnesses. They're really from the jury instructions in our country. The jury instructions in California offer jurors 13 questions to ask in their own head when assessing the claims of eyewitnesses. And they break down into 4 major categories. Were they really there to see what they said they saw? Can they be corroborated in some way by some form of corroborative evidence? Have they changed their story over time, or have they been honest and accurate? And finally, do they possess a bias that would cause them to lie to us? That's what we assess. So I just knew that was what I was going to assess when it came to the gospel authors. But the real question is, why would you need to do that? Isn't faith the kind of thing you don't need? Well, look, that's from a biblical perspective. Jesus is the premier evidentialist. There are only 2 forms of evidence available to anybody in any case, there or here. That's direct evidence, that's eyewitness accounts, and 2, indirect evidence, that's everything else. So DNA, that's indirect evidence. Fingerprints, that's indirect evidence. The only thing that counts as direct evidence is eyewitness accounts. Now, you could say, well, I don't know if you have no hard evidence for Christianity. That's not a category. The only categories are direct and indirect. And Jesus masterfully used both. He consistently relied on both. In the Gospel of John, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles I've worked in front of you. Indirect evidence. 2 have testified before. John the Baptist and my Father have testified. He's looking at direct. And who does he pick? He picks disciples that he tells, even Thomas, blessed are those who will believe what they didn't actually get to see what you saw, but they still will believe on the basis of your testimony, he says. Well, that's direct evidence. He's saying, I'm going to surround myself with witnesses that then will go out into the world. And by the way, when one of you leaves, like Judas, who does he get replaced with? Another eyewitness. That was the criteria. Peter says in Acts 1, somebody who had seen the Christ from the baptism to the resurrection. That's an eyewitness. It's direct evidence that is used throughout the book of Acts. Even Jesus spends 40 days with the disciples, giving them many more convincing proofs. In the Greek, that's the word we use for evidence. And that's in Acts 1, after the resurrection. Really? Like, I need more evidence after the resurrection? Even John the Baptist, when he sends his disciples, Jesus, John sent us. He's locked up right now, and he wants to know, are you the one? Well, he could respond a number of ways. He could say, well, look, he needs to have faith in me because faith is not dependent upon evidence. He just needs to believe. He needs to pray about this. He needs to know better. He's my cousin who knew me. He baptized me, for crying out loud. No, he does miracles in front of the disciples, and he says, go tell John what you just saw. That is a committed evidentialist. Now, so what happens is in criminal trials, we give you a number of evidences over a period of time, knowing full well, and we tell juries this, we will not be able to answer every question you're going to have. As a matter of fact, if you're the kind of person who has to have every question answered before you can render a verdict, we're not even going to impanel you because we know we can't answer every question. But we will give you a line of evidences that'll leave you short of the goal, but you'll be able to take a step toward a verdict. That step will not be uninformed. It will be informed based on the evidence we show you, but it will still be a step you're going to have to take after assessing the evidence. Now, in the Christian faith, we think there's the same kind of thing. Jesus gives us more than enough reason to believe this is true. The gospel authors record it, then they testify about it for years. But is every question? No, of course not. I have questions still, but I can take a step not called a verdict, called a step of faith, across the end of the evidence trail to the conclusion, even though I don't have every question answered. That is very much what we're trying to do in our books, as we're trying to give you, look, there's still more than enough reason if you want to say, oh, I need it all, to deny it. But you've got enough reason to believe it. And that's why we call this a step of faith.
Hmm. And that's really helpful, not least actually. And it's funny, I've come to do this webinar this evening from a large university event at lunchtime and talking to some students afterwards. And one particular student, I was speaking with for a while, had that sort of hang up really. I think was almost looking for that 100%, and helping people see that actually in so many other areas of life, as you so clearly articulated, when it comes to police work and courts, we look for that line of evidence that gets most of the way there. And then, you are going to have to take a step at some point. But one question I wanted to ask, a couple of times you mentioned at the start of your answer there, you mentioned eyewitnesses and the importance of eyewitness testimony and knowing if an eyewitness is realistic. Can you just unpack that slightly more for us? Because I know in some people's minds, and you probably hear this too, I hear people raise the objection, well, the Bible, the Gospels, I mean, they were written, decades, hundreds of years, I've heard people say, after the events. How can we be sure we're even dealing with eyewitness testimony and not stuff that's just been made up? What convinces you that we've even got that category of eyewitness testimony there in the Gospels in the first place? Help us with that one.
Yeah, well, a lot of this is cumulative, right? So when I make a case in front of a jury, I don't rely on one piece of evidence. I rely on a number of pieces of evidence that point to the same reasonable inference. And so for me, it is a cumulative case of these 4 areas of concern. But the first one is if they're not written early enough, if you want to lie about Jesus, here's how you do it. You wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Okay. This is one of the problems we have in criminal cases too. So this is the problem, I think, for the Gospels. Are they written early enough, number one, to have been written in the time span in which eyewitnesses would still be available to write them? And also written early enough to be written in the time span in which people who would know better could call them out as lies. And that's why I needed to know how early the Gospels were written. I think you can make a cumulative, circumstantial case for the early dating of the Gospels in terms of what's missing from the New Testament. So we know from the New Testament, for example, that there is no description in the book of Acts by Luke, the author of Acts, no description of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, what I think that's interesting that it's missing, and so is the siege from a couple of years earlier, the siege of Jerusalem. It's interesting that that's missing because Luke's going to talk about how Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. There's the Gospels, almost all the Gospels, all of them have some statement about this impending doom that's coming. Right. I just read through the Gospel of Mark last night with my wife. We read through the Bible together, and I think we're in chapter 12, and you'll see the descriptions of it there as well. Well, wouldn't you want to include the actual destruction of the thing that Jesus predicted if you're trying to prove that he's an accurate predictor? It's missing, though. It's not in. If you're writing a history of New York City around the 2000s and you left out the Twin Tower attack, I'd want to know why you left it out. And that siege and destruction of Jerusalem was every bit as bad in that century to those people as the Twin Tower attack was. But it's missing from Luke's book of Acts. So is the fact that we know when Peter and Paul and James, the brother of John, of Jesus rather, died, but Paul's still alive at the end of the book of Acts. There's no description of the death of Peter, no description of the death of James, the brother of Jesus. Yet Luke does describe other deaths. He describes the death of James, the brother of John. For what reason do I need to know that? He's not even a somebody. If you think about it, James, the brother of Jesus, is a somebody. So why would I be listing some but not others? Well, it's reasonable to me, it seems, at least we can test this hypothesis, that if it hasn't happened yet, there's a good reason why you might not describe it yet. And the earliest death missing is James in 61. So let's just say we're in 60-ish, is the writing of the book of Acts. Well, we know he writes 2 books. The other book he writes is the Gospel of Luke. He writes that earlier. So how much earlier is it than 60? Keep in mind that already we are within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. And you might think, well, but there's even more internal evidence within the scripture. I think you see in several places where Luke is actually referenced as scripture, the Gospel of Luke, by Paul. He talks about Luke's gospel as scripture in a letter to Timothy, for example, when he mentions a verse from Luke's gospel and compares it to Deuteronomy as quote unquote scripture. He also talks to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians, and he mentions the only version of the Lord's Supper in which Jesus says to do these things in remembrance of me. He only says that in one place. That's in the Gospel of Luke. Then he's writing that in the early 50s to the Corinthian church. There are good reasons to believe that Luke's gospel is available to Paul early, and that's why it's missing some of the data in the book of Acts, as I previously described. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think that the gospels are written early. But even if you said, well, look, 20 years is too late, because there's no way I can get that information orally over 20 years without distortion. Well, you and I both know as speakers that if we get called out to ask to do certain talks, And I do the same, like 50 talks in different locations all over the country all the time. And if you were to get the transcript of any one of my talks, I don't care if I gave it the first week or now 10 years later, you will see the transcripts are pretty much word for word the same. Even the pauses I take and how I deliver the lines are for the most part the same. My daughter noticed this when she was working the book table behind my in my room. She'd say, I now know all of your talks by heart. And to be honest, I could do a better job presenting them because I am a funnier person. And so I recognize that, yes, if I'm out and immediately telling people about what I saw over and that form of evangelism, the personal eyewitness observation, you see this in the book of Acts. If I'm doing that consistently for any period of time, I have great confidence that we can get that information to the end before it's ever penned. And the question then becomes really, well, why aren't these written earlier? Why would you wait at all? And I think there's good reason to look at those scriptures and say to yourself, hey, these folks, I think, believed that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetime. You see this all the way through the writings, that there's a sense in which, hey, we have a sense of urgency because Jesus is coming. Until, of course, we start to see our co-workers being murdered, like James, the brother of John, in 44. And I think it's then that you start to see, hey, you know what? We're not necessarily going to get out of this alive. We better start writing this stuff down. And that's when you start to see the appearance of the early Gospels.
Brilliant. That's fascinating stuff, and I completely agree with you. One other point as well I often add to folks incidentally is, that preservation of the oral teaching stuff. I love your illustration about speaking. If my family were here, they'd say the jokes. My wife would say, I tell the same jokes now as 25 years ago, and really, they haven't changed. Is, of course, if you read the Gospels carefully, you notice that Jesus sends out the disciples preaching in pairs. And of course, what are they preaching? Clearly, he's teaching them. Clearly, he's mentoring them. So they've been mentored in what they have to say by the master, even before then, Jesus has died and ascends back to heaven. So, yeah, there's every confidence that there's
and two things about that. Number one, if you know that Mormon missionaries also go out in pairs, right?
Yep.
And if you can talk about this, that transmission of ideas and how they're presented door to door, it stays the same because it's being transferred down by the pairs. There's always one guy who's got 1 year on the road, one guy who's got 2 years on the road, mentoring the guy with the 1 year on the road. So it's constantly happening that way. But also, you're absolutely right. We used to do a bunch of stuff with Frank Turek, who's an apologist here in America. And I used to listen to him. He does a lot of jokes in his presentations. And I used to tease him, dude, you do the same. I challenge you to change your jokes for this talk, and of course he would never do that. But then he said to me, Jim, you don't think that you're doing the same stuff? And I was like, oh yeah, we're all doing that. But that's why it doesn't change much in terms of the content, because we're doing it so often.
Good stuff. Oh, there's so much here we could talk about, but you've written another book that we want to talk about as well. And again, to keep teasing people listening, Jim's latest book, Person of Interest, that we'll come to in a couple of questions' time. We've got news for how you can win that. So I've got 3 or 4 questions for Jim, and then we're going to take some questions that have been submitted over social media. We've been collecting these for the last week or so, but between the interview and the Q&A, I will tell you how you might just get your hot little hands on Person of Interest. And hopefully you'll enjoy it so much you're going to buy Jim's other books. In particular, by the way, on terms of books, Jim, I have to say some of the books you've written that I love the most are the children's editions, because my kids love that kind of stuff. So it's brilliant that you've done that. But let's move on from Cold Case Christianity to the next book of yours. I remember reading and enjoying is God's Crime Scene, which is a great title. When I first heard it, I thought it was going to describe the kitchen after I've done pancakes with the kids, but that's Andy's crime scene. So God's Crime Scene, I think it's a brilliantly clever idea. And if I summarize this right, and if not, you can just mock me and do a better job of summarizing it, is the idea that actually, just as when you look around a crime scene, there's evidence and clues left behind. So when we look around this universe, there's all kinds of evidence, the fingerprints of God, as it were, all across creation, if you know to look. Is that a fair summary? And if so, what are some of the signs that God has left behind, that he has been at work, that this universe is not an accident?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think part of it, I want to try to give you a template that you can then use and apply. And a lot of times when we're working at death scenes, not every death scene is a crime scene. There are 4 ways to die. Only one of them is criminal. You can die by way of accident, suicide, natural, or homicide. These are the 4 ways people die. Only one of those concerns a homicide detective. And of course, that's a homicide. How do we determine if it's a homicide? Pretty simple. We ask the simple question: can I explain everything in the room of the death by staying in the room? If I can explain everything in the room by staying in the room, it's probably not a homicide. So for example, if there's a gunshot wound, but it's a single inflicted gunshot wound and there's a pistol in the room that belongs to the victim, And there's no other evidence that anyone has been in the room other than the victim. I can explain everything in the room by staying in the room. Well, this is probably going to be a suicide or an accidental, something like that, right? On the other hand, if I find out that gun does not belong to the victim, it's an unknown gun, and it's got unknown traces of either skin cell transfer on it or whatever, and I've got bloody footprints leading out of the room, well, now I've got evidence that I can't stay in the room to explain everything in the room. I got to figure out whose footprints those are that lead out of the room. And if the best explanation for what's in the room is a cause outside the room, well, now we know we have an intruder, and we shift everything toward a homicide. That simple template is what we do with the universe. We look in the natural room of the universe, all space, time, matter. All it really can act. The only thing you can make this soup with is space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Can I explain everything in the natural universe by staying in the natural universe? And I think there are 8 things that you have to go out of the room to explain. The origin of the universe already starts with an explanation that's outside of space, time, and matter. The fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life, the appearance of design and biology, just the existence of free will and consciousness, even the existence of transcendent objective moral standards, and even the existence of evil require an explanation that's outside the room. And that's why I think that's a better explanation. And of course, we're really just doing intruder investigations. So if there's an intruder that's outside the room of the universe, what is the nature of that? And it turns out you can actually construct a kind of a suspect profile from looking at evidence in crime scenes. I often do this with my cases. Like, I'm looking for someone who's probably going to be like this based on what I see in here. Same thing here. The nature of what it takes to be the cause of the universe, the fine-tuner of the universe, the originator of life, the fine-tuner of biology, all of these things end up providing you with a suspect profile that looks more and more like the classical definition of God that we see in the Old and New Testament. So that's why I think you can get, and this is stuff that I was doing as a new investigator. So I always tell people it was a very messy 9 months where I was constantly digging through data and building this case. Is there a God? And if there's a God, are the Gospels reliable? Is there any evidence outside the Gospels that would demonstrate this is true? It was kind of a combination of cold case Christianity, God's crime scene, and this newest book, Person of Interest, that led me to say, okay, I finally have knocked down every wall that I had constructed between myself and the gospel. And it's not that, I don't deny the power of God in this. Okay. I don't think I'm so clever I can do this on my own. But what I'm saying is I had constructed a number of excuses, a number of reasons why I would have said that there is no reason to even listen to the gospel. It's silly, it's foolishness. Of course, we know that it is, right? Because scripture tells us that it's foolishness to all of those of us who are continuing to build walls in front of it. But I just needed to do this to knock down my own walls so I could hear the gospel.
Yeah. That talk of walls and excuses is interesting, because again, this just calls to mind a conversation I've just had the last few days. Again, university student, it's a university mission season here in the UK, so I'm doing a lot on campus. I remember a couple of days ago having a fascinating conversation with a student who had actually, I think, looked at some of the evidence and sort of, was intrigued, but was still describing themselves as an agnostic. And I remember I looked at her and I said, what do you think is the objection or the stumbling block that's actually holding you back? What is it you need to know in order to take a step forward? It was interesting. She thought long and then she smiled and she said, I do wonder whether I'm using objections as a smokescreen, that actually I've answered everything I need to. I need to do something. Because we're not just brains on sticks, are we? You can find all the evidence, but there still comes that step of, but you've actually got to now put your trust, isn't it? A little bit like you found, right? So you can't argue a person or yourself into faith, presumably.
No, you can't. It's God's word, really, and the spirit, power of the spirit that does this. And I get that. And so, for example, I would have never was the kind of person who was even interested in looking at the case. And then suddenly I was. And my wife would say, well, there was the first move that, right, you were responsible for. The fact that you were willing to go to church with me, she saw as basically a bit miraculous. And a lot of that is what God's doing first, right? And so once I read, and once I had kind of confirmed that what I thought was being described in the New Testament about Jesus was true, well, now I'm reading in Romans and in 1 Corinthians, and I'm realizing that what Paul is saying about me was dead accurate. This view that we are born without sin, that we are born as pure, untainted humans that then are somehow corrupted by our environment, by our culture, or by systems within our environment and culture is simply not our experience. We know that. We don't have to train our kids to be impatient, little selfish jerks. We are kind of born that way. And so you have to kind of work to train your kids not to be that way. And once I realized that the Bible, it really does describe the world the way it really is, including humans, the way we really are. I knew that it was describing a person who needed a savior. And luckily for me, I'd already done all the heavy lifting to know there was a savior available. So now I'm just connecting my need with what I already knew was there. And that connection made all the difference in the world for me. But I recognize all along in this that God will use a number of different ways to reach you. Clearly, he doesn't even need a proclamation of the gospel. He's God. We could all be born with an innate knowledge of Jesus as Savior that we accept. That could be the way God works. It could be where it's never need to be spoken. It's just known innately. It's bred in the bone. That could be the way God works. But that's not what happens. Instead, God, for some mysterious reason, allows humans to proclaim a message to other humans. And God works in all of that. And when I think he does that is because it's all grace by which I am saved, by which I would even be interested in being saved. It's all the grace of God. But he's interested in my justification, my salvation as an act of grace, but he's also interested in my sanctification. And it turns out as I learn why this is true and then share it with others, I am changed. It's changing me now after my point of being saved. It's changing me. And that's an act of God's grace too, because clearly he doesn't need us. Yet he loves us enough to use us because he's after both of those things, our salvation and our sanctification. And when I say sanctification, what I mean is, our change, our being conformed. And by the way, you are already being sanctified to something right now. Now, here in America, we have American football. And I will tell you that when football season's on, no one probably knows more about the stupidities, the meaningless trivia of American football than I do. I mean, I am completely caught up on, all these little glowing rectangle podcasts. Oh, trust me, most of mine are sports. And I can tell you all that I'm being shaped into that image. I could basically right now probably speak on any sports show as knowledgeably as anybody they're going to have on because I'm like tracking along with everybody else. Is that really what I'm supposed to be conformed to? Is that really the best use of my time? I don't think so. So God, as an act of grace, allows me also to dig into this so I can share it with others.
Brilliant. Okay, well, there's one last book of yours, the most recent one, Person of Interest, that we're going to talk about for a few minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&A, but between those two moments, you will find out, listeners, how you can win a copy of Jim's latest book, Person of Interest. So, obviously, you've talked about cold case Christianity, the way you use the methodology of investigating these old crimes to look at the Gospels, God's crime scene, the kind of, I love that metaphor of having to step outside the room of the physical universe to explain everything. So tell us about Person of Interest. What's going on with Person of Interest, and why, I guess, do you think Jesus is a person of interest?
Well, I think part of it for me was I just thought, if this is all true and Jesus is who he said he was, do you mean to tell me the only impact he has is on 4 gospel authors in a remote part of the Roman Empire? Well, I would expect there to be like a tidal wave of information about Jesus, right? So I wanted to examine that question way back when I was first looking at Christianity. And I thought to myself, well, what if I said, look, all that can be known about Jesus is to be found on the pages of the New Testament. There's no doubt about that. But just as a thought experiment, if we were to destroy every copy of the New Testament, is Jesus the person he said he was? If that's the case, we should be able to find evidence of him in everything that he touched, everything that he impacted. There should be a bunch of ripples in that rock, in that pond where the rock landed, right? So I would want to see if there's any ripples. So here's a thought experiment. No New Testaments are available. What can be reconstructed about the person of Jesus? And how would you do that? Well, we do a lot of no-body murders where we don't have any body ever recovered. So guy kills his wife, says, oh, we had an argument, she ran away, and I haven't seen her. Reports are missing. About a week later, they take a missing person. Sometimes he'll come into the station and he'll do it at the station. No one photographs the house. No one photographs the crime scene. No one collects any evidence. 30 years later, I got a case where I have no evidence in a crime scene. No one even photographed the house. It was taken as a missing persons. And so it turns out that I got to make a case, even though I have nothing in the crime scene. Kind of like if I remove the New Testament, what can I make? I tell juries, you can tell what happened in that empty crime scene by simply examining the fuse that burned up to that explosive day. The bomb goes off. It's all this shrapnel in the blast radius. If a bomb exploded on that day, there will be a fuse and there will be fallout. I can tell you what happened on the day of the bomb exploded just by looking at the fuse and the fallout. So we took a fuse and fallout approach to Jesus of Nazareth. What is burning up to the appearance in the first century of something that then changes everything? The first century is not the first century. There's a bunch of centuries before the first century. We're calling it the first century for a reason. What's the reason? And then you can look at the fallout. And it turns out, if you look at the fallout alone, forget about the fuse for a second. The fallout alone, it turns out that things that I thought mattered as an atheist, literature, art, music, education, and science, were all utterly Jesus dependent. The sixth thing is just world religions. But I wasn't interested in world religions. Okay. I was a non-believer. So I was only interested. I was trained as an artist. I have a bachelor's degree in design, a master's degree in architecture, and then I became a detective. It's a weird way to get in. I get it. But my interest was in literature, art, music, education, science. That's what I think a lot of people think matter in our culture today. Yet they don't understand the impact that Jesus, not just that Jesus has overwhelming impact like no other historical figure in the history of historical figures, but that his entire story can be utterly reconstructed from every one of those disciplines, from just the literature in the first 200 years of the Common Era. You can reconstruct the story of Jesus. Forget about the church fathers. I list in the book all of the voices that are not Christians that appear on ancient manuscripts in the first 3 centuries before Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, from the music of that period, from the art of that period. You can reconstruct the story scene by scene. You can reconstruct every single gospel episode, and every single gospel can be reconstructed from art before the end of the Dark Ages. That's how powerful his influence on the arts is. Not only that, every art. And so you can reconstruct the story, and every major artist has painted, etched, sculpted, or drawn Jesus. Every major, the top 3 in every historical genre. This is true also for music. This is true also for education. You realize that we basically invented the modern university. Now, look, the ancients had ways to train each other, and they had ways to educate each other. But if you're thinking of the modern university like you and I think of it, with a campus in which students come and they are with a resident faculty that eventually give them a diploma for completing a course of curriculum over several years, that notion is born in Oxford, Bologna, and Paris. And those are Christian universities from which the first 24 daughter universities are born that then give birth to all of the people, the major players in the scientific revolution. So you can reconstruct the story of Jesus from just the top 15 universities in the world by simply visiting their campuses. You can reconstruct the story of Jesus more robustly than any other way from the personal writings of the science fathers, the major founders of every major modern scientific discipline. It turns out we are overwhelmingly overrepresented as Christians. As a matter of fact, even today, more Nobel Prize winners in the sciences come out of Christianity than any other worldview. As in fact, all other worldviews combined. So we just have to be able to understand that this is the kind of amazing impact that Jesus has had. And if you think about it, it speaks to something important evidentially. Look, there's not any fictional character that's had this kind of impact on human history. Who would that be? Peter Pan? Luke Skywalker? Who's going to be? Name somebody who's a fictional character who's had the kind of impact. You could reconstruct a story from literature, art, music, science, education, and world religions. You're not going to find anybody. That's why I think it's a reasonable inference that Jesus is something other than fiction. Also, you're not going to find another living mortal human being who's had this kind of impact. And you can list all of them. I do in the book. Everyone from the first century of importance, everyone from every century is important. No one has had this kind of impact on literature, art, music, education, science, and world religions, and can be completely reconstructed from those areas of culture. Nobody. So it's reasonable. It's a reasonable inference that Jesus is something other than a mortal human. Of the 3 possibilities, fiction, regular guy, or the God of the universe who enters back into his creation, only one has the explanatory power to describe why Jesus would have this kind of impact. And that's why I think that this approach actually has some merit. And it was part of the 3 legs. Number 1, is the Bible reliable? Number 2, does God exist? And number 3, is there any evidence in the history of humans outside of Scripture that would confirm any of this stuff? That's what I had to do in my own warped way of thinking to be able to accept a premise like this. As a guy who was not a believer in God, how do I get from there to here? Well, that's how I got from there to here.
Fascinating, Jim. One last question, perhaps briefly, if you may, just as then we're going to move into a little bit of time of Q&A. And I have been promising I will tell people how to win a copy of Person of Interest. Obviously, you've been on quite a journey from atheist and sort of not a follower of Jesus through discovering and encountering and having that experience of being found by him, and now sharing all you have with others. This is a bit of a sneaky question, but I guess, what have you learned over that journey, perhaps that surprised you the most, looking back on it? Because you've looked at evidence, you've shone the light into all kinds of corners. Lots of things I'm sure have surprised you, but what would be one of the biggest surprises that this journey of discovery you've been on has thrown up?
Well, I'll give you one that maybe is going to seem odd, but and I don't want this is not. I'll just say it. I'm surprised that I kind of thought when I became a Christian this way that isn't this what everyone does? I mean, like I kind of thought, well, people are Christians because of the potential worldviews that are presented to them. This is the one that comports with reality. When what I discovered is just the opposite. Most of us, and not just Christians, but hold a worldview for all kinds of reasons that have little or nothing to do with evidence. They may just be expedience. It might be that it comports with the way you are emotionally wired. It might be that you've had a personal experience. There's other reasons why people hold to whatever worldview they hold to. Forget about Christianity; it could be any worldview. And a part of this is my weird upbringing. And the way I look at evidence and how we use evidence, and isn't that what, I'm doing it for a living and now kind of doing it for a life, that I thought, well, everyone assesses claims this way. And when I discovered that wasn't true, what I realized, number one, was you better shut up when it comes to like, I don't want to, it's not an either or. I think that for those of us who have come to this reality, are here and have accepted Christ as Savior, even though you may never ever examine the evidence, that's perfectly great. I mean, I think though, in the end though, when it comes down to, well, why is this true? And I think we are in a culture right now that's asking that question. That's where we got to shift. So it's one thing to say, hey, you could be in the right place for the wrong reason. You can be in the right place by accident. Or you can be in the right place because you've examined what all the evidence is that would incline you to believe it's the right place. And I think we're in a culture right now where most young people are being told that you need to ask those two whys for every what. Two whys for every what. The what is God exists. Jesus is God. That's a what claim. But the question is, why do we think that's true? And I think that most young people are seeing that whatever the claims are being made by culture, they're trying to support them with the science, with the evidence. Like, they're giving you reasons why and you Christians, you just believe this blindly. But we don't have that kind of silly approach to things. We actually follow the science, we follow the evidence. But you guys can't do that. Well, we could do that. We just don't. But the point is, that first why is it true? The second why is so why do I care? Why does it matter to me? I get it. You're like a 60-year-old geeked out, theologian or detective, but it doesn't really apply to me. It doesn't really matter to me. And I think that's why I wrote this book the way we did, because I thought that, hey, we've written books about why is it true, but it turns out Jesus still matters. And he matters. And by the way, he doesn't matter because those things, literature, education, music, science, that's not why Jesus matters. Those things matter because of Jesus. Those things matter because Jesus is the source of those things. It's just the opposite. But I think we have to be able to answer the two whys. What I'm surprised sometimes is that most of us will make a case for that. If we're going to pick an insurer for our home or a medical insurance, we are going through the systems to see, like, what's the case for the best medical insurance I should have. But when it comes to worldviews, they're really the only true fire insurance. We don't often take that approach. And that has surprised me.
Interesting. Well, we have some questions in a minute for you, Jim, that come in from kind of social media. And I've got 4 great questions that I'm going to put you in a second as we have the last 20 minutes of this. Before that, I have been teasing people all the way through. So we have 4 copies of Jim's fantastic new book, Person of Interest, that he was talking about there a few minutes ago to give away. So there'll be a slide in a minute coming up with the details. There you go. So the free book draw, all you have to do to be entered into the draw to win a copy of Jim's latest book is simply to email us at support@solascpc.org. Just give your name, and then we will pick 4 winners out of the hat. The one condition, there's always a small bit of small print. The one condition is you do need to be living in the UK for this. Jim's book has been all over the US. Everyone in America knows who Jim is, but he's not so well known over here. So this is for UK listeners and watchers. If you are somewhere else in the world, that's fantastic. You will have to get the book wherever books are sold. If you're in the UK, want to win a copy of this, email support@solascpc.org. And on the Monday following this broadcast going out, we will pull names out of a hat and to get in touch with you and get a book to you. So, you know, there's not much that's free in this life, but, you know, there you go, copy Jim's book. So, Jim, I'm glad where you ended a moment ago about the, you know, the different kind of questions that's worth asking. The first question we've actually had in on social media, and I'd love to put this to you, is just to unpack a little bit more about what you said there a moment ago. Somebody asked, why bother with God anyway? I mean, what difference does it make? Now, I know you've got some huge thoughts on that question, but give us the kind of short answer to that question. Why bother with God anyway? What would you say to the person?
So I think a lot of this comes down to, you know, it's not just God, it's the Christian view. If you don't believe that the scriptures describe the world the way it really is, then I think then this is a good question to ask. Like, why would you read things that don't have any relationship to reality? I have a drawer here sitting right in my desk. I'm sitting at my desk in my office, and I have a drawer here. And in this drawer, I'm going to make a little noise here. I have every manual that has ever been, like if I buy something and it's got like a manual about how to operate it, I have it in this drawer, and I keep them for a while. And then eventually, once I've mastered that and I have no more questions about that device that I have a manual for, I throw the manual out because it's not really relevant anymore, right? I've already mastered this, or I don't use that product anymore. Why am I keeping this vacuum cleaner manual if I know how to work the vacuum cleaner? So off it goes. And it turns out, I think that's reasonable. It's reasonable to kind of discard as meaningless those things that no longer apply to your life. This is not the case, though, with the New Testament or the Old Testament. These are ancient documents that describe everything in our world the way it really is. Now, look, I know that's becoming more and more controversial, because I think people are saying, well, look, God doesn't even matter because Christianity doesn't matter, because let's face it, Christianity teaches things that we would say, atheists would say, well, really, isn't all misogyny, racism, homophobia, all that stuff's in the scripture, right? Well, it turns out that there are some principles that we have to, I would have said as an atheist, that, you know, there's a 4,000-year-old book that, of course, does get some things right about humans, because if you have 4,000 years worth of time to write about humans, you're probably going to make some observations. You'll find wisdom in the Proverbs, for example, because there's like, duh, this is people just make, I didn't think it was divine. I just thought it was vetted by time, by humans. There are good reasons. That's a manual that I dare not throw away, because that manual ends up continuing to describe the world the way it really is. Now, you may not want to bend your knee to it right now, because there are certain things in culture that are shifting. But it turns out that the biblical values, when they're held by humans, end up providing human flourishing like no other set of principles. Now, you could argue that's just because they're ancient, and because, you know, people eventually observe true things about humans and write them down, or they are divine. But one thing I know for sure is that training manual, now look, this doesn't even talk about the power of salvation. If all you were doing was looking at it in the isolated perspective of, does it still apply to me? Does it still describe things about me that are true, that my deepest insights? There's a reason why addiction programs, for example, that are grounded in a biblical worldview. Now, I'm not talking about like 12-step programs that are not, even the ones that are not biblically based are usually point to some divine authority, because they understand the power that's in that approach. But now, even here in America, we've got several that are like 12-step programs that are really, truly grounded in biblical principles. And those programs have an overwhelmingly more successful impact on addicts and on alcohol users than on other programs. Why? Because it turns out this manual ends up describing us the way we really are. And so why care about, look, if for purely selfish reasons that were based on just your temporal life from the age of, you know, birth to the age of 90 when you're going to die, or whatever that year is for you, there will be more than enough reason. On the other hand, if Christianity is true, life is not a line segment from birth to death. It's a ray from birth through the point we call death and off into infinity, into eternity. And if that's the case, well, then all you know is going to limit and only help you in the first part of the line segment. But there's a whole much deeper, much longer period of time that's on the other side of the second dot. And this is the one book that tells you how to experience that. And so that's why I think it does still matter.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that, Jim. I hope it was helpful if whoever asked that was listening. Okay, next question to go. We've really got some doozies for you. This here's one that could be a whole webinar its own right, but we'll go for a short answer. So, Jim, someone asked, you obviously talked about, I think they're particularly thinking on the God's crime scene stuff and the various clues. I think this person's suggesting, what about clues that would point the other way? And the example they point to is evolution. Don't they say, doesn't the fact of evolution disprove the Bible? And we're not kind of God's special creation. It's just time plus chance plus natural selection. Now, there's many things we could say.
Yeah, many things we could say. Yeah, okay, I'll try to give you the shortest. Yeah, we've got friends. You and I both have friends who are Christians, who are apologists, who would say, "Well, I don't really see there's really a rub. Even if evolution was true, that would not in itself falsify Christianity." I hold a view. I'm not a theistic evolutionist. I don't think these two things are compatible. I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest kind of from molecule to man type of evolution across species is even possible, given the evidence we have. The evidence we have is really leans more toward bursts of transformational change, which could also be explained by common creator rather than just common form or common ancestry. It could also be common creator kind of stuff that we're seeing. So I think that for me, the evidence is just not strong enough. Now, look, we believe as Christians in change over time within a species. We believe that because we know we're descended from the same pair of humans, although we look very, very different. And then we're at funnel point again at Noah and his 3 sons. Yet here we are, as different as we all are, because there's a certain amount of change within the species that I think God has pre-designed into our genomes so that we can survive depending on environment. So this idea of, and I don't want to use the words like a micro and macro, because then you get debates about whether those are reasonable terms to use. But I will say this, the idea that we can somehow get from, look, everything is so utterly dependent on information in the genome that I don't know how you can deny the involvement of a designer or of intelligence or of a mind. I always put it this way. If you think that we believe in progressive creation, we do, in the sense that even if you believe, regardless what your view on Genesis 1 is, God could easily have blinked it all into existence in a millisecond, but instead he takes 6 steps. So there's a series of progressive steps. It appears that he's putting some things in place before other things emerge. Well, so we believe in a progressive creation in that sense. Now, you can argue about how he's doing it and how long each period of the steps takes. But the idea that somehow things are happening in progressive steps, I think, is what we would also accept. We'd also accept change over time within a species, because this is something we see on the pages of Scripture. So I think there are some ways we would probably step toward these notions, but I don't think there's enough evidence. And I think really DNA is the reason why I don't think there is. And I'll just put it to you this way. It turns out the formations of everything from amino acids, or the formations of amino acids into proteins, or the formations of proteins into the molecular machines that are in your body, is not driven by space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. If that stuff's driven by space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, you do not need to insert God into the equation. It appears that all of that is driven by information in the genome. Now, how do we get information in the genome? Now, this is something that people are either going to deny that it's information, or they're going to deny that you have to use mind to get information. But the instructive quality, and I talk about this in God's Crime Scene, the levels of information that we typically use when we're thinking about information theory, well, DNA falls into the highest level of information, in that, number one, it actually is in a certain order. It is prescriptive. It waits for certain things it's trying to get to goals. The way I don't see how you can consider it anything other than code or information. And if I had a crime scene, a death scene, where I walked in and there's a guy laying on the floor and there's blood spatter on the wall, and you said, well, I'm not sure if this is a murder or not, because there's 4 ways to die, we talked about. Well, it turns out that space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can cause blood spatter. If he just fell accidentally and hit his head, it might look like that. If he committed suicide and hit his head, it might look like that. If he had a heart attack naturally and hit the ground and hit his head, it might look like that. So if I just have blood spatter, I don't need mind for that. I get that with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. On the other hand, if I walk into the same room and on the wall, instead of blood spatter, I have a message, he deserved it, written in his own blood, I think you and I are going to start looking for a suspect, right? Because we know you cannot get that with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. And so it's the role that DNA plays in all of this that inclines me to say, well, whatever it ends up being the case, you're going to have to include mind. You're going to have to include intelligence in the process. And that's why I think that the better inference is that God is somehow involved in that process.
Brilliant. Well, we are running rapidly out of time, and this has been incredibly helpful, Jim. So let me ask you one kind of last question. Every question could potentially be a $64 million question, but this definitely is the $64 million question, because I think so much stands on it. And you've touched on it a couple of times this evening, but it's the resurrection of Jesus. So somebody sort of said, okay, Jim, you're a police guy, you deal in proof. Can you prove that Jesus rose from the dead? Isn't it just it's a lovely story, but can we prove that to be the case? I thought you'd like that one. Have a go at that.
Okay. Yeah. So this is the one we're going to do in like speed round, right? Speed round, resurrection proof. Okay. So yeah. I never use typically the word proof. You won't find it in my books. I don't use it because a proof is in the mind of the whole of the assessor. So I might say something to one juror, and the jury says, "Oh, that proved it to me," but then it turns out some other piece of evidence proved it to another juror, and I never know. That's why we do a robust cumulative case, because we don't know what's going to hold that kind of weight. Now I can say I've got good reason to believe this is true based on the evidence. This is the most reasonable inference from evidence. And remember, my standard is not beyond a possible doubt. If it was beyond a possible doubt, you'd never prove anything to anybody. I'd never win a single verdict. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lower standard. It leaves the gap for possible questions or imaginary questions, but you get to an evidential standard, a certain place where you have enough reason to believe it's true. It's called reasonable doubt. And that's the only thing you need for anything you assess, because you're never going to know. You don't know anything right now beyond a possible doubt. You don't know that we're actually having this conversation the way we are. This could all be CG. You don't know beyond a possible doubt, but you know it's reasonable. And so in the end, for the resurrection, I simply needed to know, of all the possible explanations, which is reasonable? Of all the possible, and knowing that every possible explanation is going to have strengths and some weaknesses. And even the real case, when I present a defendant to a jury, I know my case is strong, but I also know it has weaknesses, because every case has weaknesses. So I would say that when it comes down to the resurrection, the empty tomb, the claims of the disciples, this event that changes history, all of this, make a list of all you think is evidence, and then make a list of all the possible explanations. As I do that, I see maybe 7. They're either lying about it, they're delusional about it, they're mistaken that he's not really dead. I made a list of all the ways you could explain it where from an atheistic perspective. And there's like 6. Maybe 7. Then, of course, you have the last explanation, which is the Christian one that just says, yeah, it's true. Now, I went through all of those explanations, just kind of crossing out which ones don't work. And there's a reason, by the way, when atheists make a list of these ways to explain it, there's more than one explanation. If you hold to explanation 2, it's because you don't think explanation 1, 3, 4, 5, or 6 works. And it doesn't. That's why you have so many varied explanations. This is why defense attorneys will say, well, it could be one of these 8 things. Yeah, but none of those 8 things work, which is why you're offering 8 things. You're hoping that a juror will just glob onto one of them. But it turns out there's one explanation, ours. It has a weakness. It best explains the evidence. It explains the evidence in a way that's far more robust than any of the atheist explanations, but it has a weakness. The weakness is it requires a resurrection. In other words, it requires something supernatural. But that's the whole question under investigation. Is something supernatural, like a resurrection, ever the most reasonable explanation? Now, I would have said no, because I was a confirmed philosophical naturalist. I would have said no. But think about this for a second. Really? So I already believed as an atheist in Big Bang cosmology. That's the standard cosmology. I believe there was something outside of space, time, and matter that caused the universe to come into existence. Now, I would have said that was an impersonal force, but I'm already outside the room. That is a supernatural or extra natural cause outside of what's natural, whatever's in space, time, or matter. So I'm already outside of a natural cause to explain the beginning of the universe. So if there's something that begins the universe, if that's the most impressive miracle in Scripture is not in the New Testament, it's Genesis 1. Everything from nothing. If that occurred, why am I like all the stuff in the New Testament is small potato stuff? If you can do that first thing, you can probably do those other things. So the question for me is, why am I holding it this way? Let's put it this way. If there was no claim of the supernatural in the New Testament, nobody would doubt the historicity and accuracy. If all it was recording is the wise wisdom sermons and nice deeds of Jesus of Nazareth, who never worked a miracle, never healed anybody, never rose from the dead, never born of a virgin, this would be the best attested ancient in the history of ancients. Nobody would doubt a single thing. This is not based on manuscript evidence. The hesitancy when it comes to Jesus is based on a presuppositional bias against the supernatural. Insert one miracle, can't be trusted. So this is really about our presuppositions. So as you look at the evidence for this, and I do this in chapter 2 of Cold Case, the best explanation, even though it has a weakness of supernaturalism, is still the Christian explanation. And that's why there are so many alternatives offered by naysayers, because they know that those don't work. And if you're somebody who holds, oh, he wasn't really dead, it's because you reject the idea that they imagined it. You reject some other explanation. Well, I'm suggesting just reject all those explanations, because the best explanation is really the one that only thing that stops you from believing it is your own bias against the supernatural. And if you believe in Big Bang cosmology, you've already jumped that bar. So why would you let this be a problem for you to believe when it comes to the New Testament?
Yes. Well, as one of my friends likes to put it, you either believe in the virgin birth of the Messiah, or you believe in the virgin birth of the universe. Pick your miracle. Jim, this has been an absolutely fascinating hour. You are one of the few people I know who I think can actually speak faster than I can, which is something of a record. So the amount of information that we've jammed in here has been hugely helpful, and so we appreciate you being with us. One last plug: if you want to get hold of Jim's book, well, there have been many books. You can look from wherever books are sold, but his website is personofinterestbook.com. Don't forget to enter the book competition. Email support@solascpc.org. We have 4 Jim's books to give away. We're drawing names out of the virtual hat on Monday, so just email us with your name. You have to be in the UK, I'm afraid, and we'd love to get some copies out to you. The publisher have kindly given that to us. And on that, it merely falls to me to say, Jim, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for you and all the stuff that you do. You are a unique voice. We've all learned loads from you, and the amount you write too puts the rest of us to shame. So I'm looking forward to whatever the next book in the series is. But thank you for joining us and giving up your time today.
Hey, thanks so much. Andy, when you first talked about doing this, I could not wait to do it, because I so love your work. So thanks so much for having me.
Brilliant. All right, and well, God bless, and to all of you watching at home or wherever you're catching this, hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we'll be back in a month or so's time with another great guest. So join us then. Bye for now.